Welcome everybody, my name is Eric, and I'm unemployed. No. Exactly. The future of API management. So before I start talking about the future of API management, very briefly, this is apart from the first one, this is the second advertisement, but the different one. So if you're interested in APIs and you want to get some videos about it, interviews with cool people talking about interesting API topics, please check out my channel. I'm active on YouTube. There's a new video out today. So I try to talk to interesting people about interesting things because that's a lot of fun. And yeah, so please go over there and check it out if you're interested in API news, so to speak. Okay, now onwards to the actual topic of the talk. The future of API management in my mind is always, so I have a tech background. I studied computer science. I spent a lot of time at universities with computer networking stuff. So I'm a technologist at heart. But after I entered the API space, so to speak, it became very interesting for me to see that in the end, the biggest opportunities and the biggest challenges that you see out there are not really technological, right? It's often just the question of how do we use those APIs in the best possible way to get the best possible outcomes. And it's very important that I think we do not lose sight of that. And therefore, I think when we talk about the future of API management, it's also always interesting to just always keep in mind that even though I would assume most of us here are kind of technologists, that the technology that we work with and that is kind of our day job in the end always has some purpose. And this purpose in the API space, I think, gets elevated more and more as APIs become more and more visible. Everybody talks about APIs. Nothing works without APIs. And everything in the world gets an API, right? So it becomes more and more apparent that APIs are not just technology. Of course, they're technology, but they're much more than that. And therefore, one thing I've learned is that whenever you talk about APIs with people, it's very important to talk about, to make sure that you talk about the same things. Because when you talk about APIs, depending on who you talk to, right, people talk about very different things. So if you talk to old school IT guys, for them, so my professor that I worked with a long time ago, when I told him I have an API job now, he was very confused because he had no idea what that would be. Because for him, an API is just a thing on a computer, right? Like Unix APIs and like local programming APIs. And he was very confused why anybody would pay you for working just on those APIs and not on, for example, operating systems. But that's, of course, that changed a long time ago. So if you talk to most people about APIs, right, at least they will probably agree that an API is networked, which already is quite a shift, right? Then if you talk to maybe more like an IT architect, for them an API is just kind of a different way how you can plug stuff together. There may be different integration patterns, and an API is one way to do it, and there are others that you can use. If you talk to CDOs, for them APIs, they don't really know what an API is, to be honest, but they've heard of them and they know that they're important. So they just try to make sure that everything gets an API because that's probably good. And then when you talk to CEOs, right, for them APIs is just all they have heard is an API economy. Apparently there are companies that make a lot of money with APIs, so that's a good thing. And so what I want to show by this is just that if you talk about APIs, before you jump into any deeper discussion, make sure you know what you're talking about and what your peer is talking about, because otherwise you will have very confusing conversations. I've had many of those. And it's always important to keep in mind, please raise your hand if you know this excellent movie. Come on, people. That's it. Zoolander. You all should watch that tonight. It's very good. So these are two not too bright people, as you may be able to tell. And sometimes the same happens, I think, for us in the API space, where because there's so much hype around APIs, people assume that, well, if we put an API around something, that's good, right? That then a lot of good things will happen. And basically, I think sometimes our job is to say, maybe, right? It's probably good to put APIs around things, and good things may happen, but if we put them around the wrong things, or we don't really think about who's going to consume them, then probably not that much may happen. Because, and this is my new goal is in every presentation and video and interview I do to mention this because of the Spice Girls question. So the Spice Girls question, which is not my idea, Stephen Bungay, a management consultant, introduced me to this wonderful idea, is to always ask, tell me what you want, tell me what you really, really want. And I think that's really important to keep in mind for us as API people because, shocking news, nobody wants APIs. Right? Nobody wants APIs. People want to get stuff done. They want to get access to customer data. They want to put orders in. They want to know where their package is. They want to, whatever they want to do, but nobody wants APIs. Everybody needs APIs to get stuff done, but nobody really wants just the API. So it's really important to always keep that in mind. And that's what I will get to in a minute, right? To really think about the APIs are not the important thing. The important thing is what we wrap in that API. And if you wrap something really pointless into an excellent API, that doesn't matter, right? And maybe it's a nice API to teach API design, but it's pointless. But for example, if you wrap something super duper useful in the most horrible API, people will still use it. They won't be happy, but if it's super duper useful, right, they will use it because, well, we have to somehow work with this terrible API. We don't like it, but we'll do it. So I think it's important for us to always keep that in mind, right? And before we jump into this exercise of, oh, should we get or post or put or whatever, to think about who are we doing this for and what are we actually trying to accomplish with that? And trying to do the best possible job oftentimes is much more than just thinking about how do we design the API exactly, but more like what do we even expose as APIs? Who do we expose it to? And how do we make them aware of it? How do we tell everybody that we have these wonderful APIs that they can use? How do we tell our partners how to use them? How do we show them what they can build with those things? And I think that is something that us as API community sometimes are still struggling with a little bit, is this gap between us doing something deeply technical, yes, but also us doing something that now is so visible to so many people who are not really deep into technology, right? They're more into business ideas, digital transformation, maybe what kind of, maybe democratization of knowledge, how can I get access to information to my citizens, whatever it is that they're doing, right? But they're not really mainly interested in APIs or technologies, right? They're just interested in what they can do with it. And I think that's the challenge that we often have, is to bridge that gap between the technologically minded community that we are and those other communities who are not technologically minded necessarily, but who really know that they need these things and who we should start engaging with in the best possible way. And I want to just briefly go through, I think, 3 simple ways for how you can maybe do that a little bit better. And the 3 simple ways are to start approaching APIs with a product mindset. I'll talk about these 3 in a little bit more detail in a minute. To manage APIs as business assets, and to also start, and this is, I think, where also, and you come from a technology background, right? When you talk about API marketing, and then, like, people always think like, ew, this is something icky. My API has to be so great that I don't have to market it, right? It's going to be the best API that ever existed, so people will naturally flock to it. But they may not even know that it exists, right? So that doesn't really matter that much. So this is something that we also have to get used to become a little bit more proactive in trying to make sure that people actually use our APIs, because if we build an API and it's not getting used, it's totally pointless, right? It's absolutely useless. It doesn't make any sense. So we have to make sure it gets used. Okay, let's start with looking a little bit into the product mindset. And this is something maybe not so much here, but if you, at this conference, but if you go out, so to speak, in the bigger IT world, there still is not really, I would say, such a focus on products and what that really means when we talk about API products. So one thing I'd like to start with is this is from Merriam-Webster, just the definition of a product, right? What is a product? And one of the interesting things that it says here, it's a commodity, right? It is something such as a service that is marketed or sold as a commodity, meaning it's not something you produce just for one consumer, because that's not a product. That's just an item that you create for somebody and give to somebody, and that's it, right? It's not a product. But a product is something that does this, it creates this possibility of somebody creating a product, somebody consuming the product, and the product is the thing in the middle, right? It's that intermediate layer, so to speak. And we really have to try to make sure that we keep that in mind and build a good product. And one of the things that sometimes when you think about what a good product is, and I'm not a big fan of these coffee thingies, but just looking from a product perspective, I mean, I think you have to admit it's a pretty nicely designed product. So how many people here are using espresso capsules at home? Ah, you're very honest. Thank you. Sometimes I think everybody's like, no, I'd rather not tell. But I mean, they're brilliant, right? I mean, they're ecologically a catastrophe, and they're super duper expensive, but they're really well-designed products, right? And I think it's a good example to keep, like, and why? Well, because they're convenient, they're kind of fun to use, they actually make pretty decent coffee, and also Nespresso or Nestle marketed the hell out of them, right? That's also important. So it's really something, right, where you need the whole package to get to something that gets very successful. Of course, I don't think any of us will design the Nespresso of APIs. That would be pretty cool. That's a very high bar, I would say, to pass. But at least keeping in mind that products are much more than just trying to make sure that something doesn't suck, right? It's really trying to make sure that you build something with consumers in mind, that's easy to use, that you also keep in mind that you, even though it's easy to use, you probably still want to find your consumers and talk to them and kind of explain to them why they should consider using your product, or however you phrase that. So the question is, and sometimes I have to say these days I get a little annoyed when the focus is only on developer experience, right? When people say, oh, that's all you need, developer experience. And I don't think that's quite true. I think developer experience is important. You need developer experience, probably. So your API shouldn't be horrible to use. But on the other hand, I think it's also important to keep in mind, you also have to think about the user experience, right? So those developers, what are they building? Well, they're building applications. Will those applications deliver value to users? If not, then even the best developer experience doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So I really have to think about what kind of functionality, what kind of services do I expose, so that then after I expose them through nice developer experience to developers, they build apps that really get users to use my services, because that's your goal. Which brings us one level further up, right? Where in the end, it's also not just important that the users are getting something out of it. You also have to get something out of it, right? So if you create an API where every time somebody calls the API, your credit card, you get a $10 added to your credit card, users would love that, right? Everybody builds APIs with that, and every user just sits at home and just click, click, click. But it's very hard to imagine how an organization would build such an API, because there's not a lot of value for the organization in that, right? So you also have to think about, how do we not just build good APIs that allow the developers to build good applications, but also how do we wrap that in a more holistic package where we build those APIs that in the biggest possible way help our organization. Sometimes that may mean you want to make money. If you're in a government agency, it may mean you want to make your citizens happy, right there. What it means to create value for the organization depends on the goals of your organization. But I think really stepping back and not too much obsessing over developer experience over everything else, I think this is something that sometimes get a little bit lost. So please don't quote me in saying that developer experience is not necessary. I think it is, but it's kind of it's a little bit of a balanced image there, I think. Okay, now let's look at managing APIs a little bit better as products, right? Now that we've agreed that maybe we want to have some that actually are better products, how do we manage them? So what do we see in organizations, right, where the future of API management is going? There's a big focus on simplifying API production, making it easier for people to actually create APIs, hopefully after they had a good idea for an API product, to unify those APIs across an API landscape, and to also make it easier to find and use APIs. And the way that happens, right, is that we see more and more tooling. So this is a screenshot from Stoplight, who weirdly don't seem to be here. Anybody from Stoplight? No. Yes, okay, great. Stoplight has something out there that's called Spectral. It's wildly popular because it's one of these many tools out there. So it's just an example how you can better automate your API productivity, so to speak, right? So it's something where you can, in that case, check open API descriptions against certain rule sets, just making sure that those open API descriptions follow certain rules that you have put in place. So it just raises the quality bar on your APIs in a scalable way, right? And that's very important. And that's important because, I mean, we won't stop producing APIs and refactoring APIs anytime soon, right? API technologies change, so here are maybe the last 4 ones. And I have no idea, since this is called the future of API management, maybe I should have put whatever the future after events is, but I don't know. If anybody knows, let me know, please. But these things will change. We will see more technologies coming up. We will probably also see different preferences for how to use certain technologies. But the important thing is, the more we automate, the easier we can manage that change. Right? In the end, all the automation is something that helps us to keep track with how things are changing. And that's an important thing to do. And it's so important that it's really something where more and more organizations are looking into how to manage their entire API landscapes, right? And that's such a big topic that a couple of years ago, we actually decided to write a book about it, Mehdi being one of the co-authors. And the idea there was really to not just look at APIs, but to look at API landscapes. And that's something that I see in organizations more and more happening, that they put API programs into place, or they actually create explicit API strategies, or they have API initiatives. Doesn't matter how you call these things, but that there is, from the top down, a strategic will to invest into API things, right? Where they say APIs are going to be important for us more and more going forward, so we need to be as good as we can in managing those APIs. And this brings me to my last thing, and this is probably also where we have seen the least development so far, but it's you can tell already just by wandering the booths out here that it's already happening, is that there's a bigger focus on consumption, right? It becomes more and more important to not just produce APIs, but you really think about, well, how do APIs produce value if they're consumed, right? So it kind of really doesn't make that much sense to just produce APIs and then say, okay, I'm done, right? Mission accomplished. It's really much more effective to